How does a normal person become a Buddha, an enlightened one, a fully awakened, wise, and compassionate being, someone who has realized the true meaning of life? This is the central question of Buddhism. In his first teaching after the Enlightenment, the Buddha presented the world with his basic answer, the foundation of his 45 years of teaching. He gave his insight in the framework of what he called the Four Noble Truths. That is, four things which are facts for a noble, or as he defined it, awakened person. The noble truth of suffering was first. The noble truth of the origin of suffering came next. Third and most important, the noble truth of the cessation of suffering. And fourth, the noble truth of the path that leads to the cessation from suffering. In July of 1996, His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama of Tibet gave 2 days of teachings on the Four Noble Truths at the Barbican Hall in London. It was a historic occasion. The Dalai Lama was invited by 26 different groups who are part of the network of Buddhist organizations in the UK. They span practically the entire spectrum of Buddhist traditions in the world. And while the historical significance of the teachings on the Four Noble Truths had a lot to do with it being the first time he had given them in such complete detail in the West, even more significant was the fact that it was the first time in modern Buddhist history that a major teaching was requested and attended by ordained clergy from just about every Buddhist denomination. The Barbican event was an ecumenical first. That it happened at all was undoubtedly due to the great respect with which the Dalai Lama is held, not just in the Buddhist world, but in the world at large. Up to 1949, when Tibet was invaded by Mao's Red Army, it was an isolated, forbidden land on the roof of the world, where foreigners were allowed only under special circumstances. In the Western imagination, and through most of the East as well, the Dalai Lamas were mythic figures shrouded in a far-off world of magic and mystery. When he was forced to flee Tibet in 1959, the 14th Dalai Lama brought much of that magical world with him into the 20th century. Since the mid-70s, he has traveled widely, speaking out on the tragedy of what is happening in Tibet, and teaching the tens of thousands of Westerners who are attracted to Buddhism. People sense that this simple monk, with the warm smile and enthusiastic laugh, really seems to live everything he talks about. Given the amount of time he spends devoted to his people, his mastery of the philosophies of all the Tibetan schools is astonishing. Even among Tibetan High Lamas, he is held in a respect that borders upon awe. So when he came to London to teach the Four Noble Truths, there was great anticipation of a truly memorable teaching. The Four Noble Truths are the foundations of Buddhism, the common ground of all the diverse Buddhist traditions in the world. We're told in the Dhammapada, a collection of the Buddha's most ancient sayings, that in the days following his enlightenment, the Buddha sat in perfect peace under the Bodhi tree. When he looked out at the passing world and saw the suffering of the masses of humanity, he wondered how the truth that he had realized, so subtle and profound, could be understood by others. He debated whether to remain in silence. Finally, moved by compassion for those with, as the sutra describes it, only a little dust in their eyes, he resolved to seek out the ascetics who had been his companions until just before his enlightenment. He found them in the deer park at Sarnath. There he first turned the wheel of Dharma with the teachings on the Four Noble Truths. By the end of the teaching, all five had realized enlightenment. The Four Noble Truths are often misunderstood as delivering a pessimistic message that suffering is inevitable. The precise opposite is the case. The major announcement of the truths is that suffering can be overcome. Buddha's unprecedented discovery was that freedom is possible. As he put it, the door to nirvana is open. The fact of nirvana is the third noble truth. Thus, the first noble truth is only the diagnosis of the problems of the unenlightened. The unenlightened do not know that their normal state is suffering compared to nirvana, why that is so, and that there is a complete cure and how it works. The Four Truths help us to understand these things one by one. As the Dalai Lama says, one must recognize the illness of suffering before one can attempt to cure. Recognizing the cause, one realizes that there is a cure, and then one can aspire to gain freedom from suffering. At the Barbican, the Dalai Lama taught the Four Noble Truths from the viewpoint of early monastic Buddhism first, then from the Mahayana or Universalist perspective, and finally from the point of view of Tibetan Vajrayana Buddhism. According to His Holiness, all these schools teach ways to understand the true nature of reality. Of these, most agree that the Middle Path Consequence School, you'll hear it referred to by its Sanskrit name of Madhyamaka Prasangika, is the most advanced and scientifically precise. It was developed from the teachings of the 2nd century Indian Buddhist sage Nagarjuna by his most influential follower, the 7th century sage Chandrakirti. Madhyamaka Prasangika philosophers observe and explore physical and mental things and conclude that nothing exists absolutely, independently in isolation, but all things exist only relatively, depending on their causes and conditions. For example, this table here seems to possess an intrinsic tableness, an identity belonging to a class of objects of a certain form that perform a certain function. But obviously it didn't just materialize as a table from that seemingly intrinsic tableness. Before it was a table, it was lumber, and before it was lumber, it was a tree. Its tableness is a result of causes that other causes can remove. What does sit here is more or less a temporary configuration of wood that we can designate a table. In fact, I am presently using it as a chair. And if we were all termites, we might designate it as dinner. Similarly, everything in this universe of ours exists because of an interdependent network of causes and conditions. Everything is empty of intrinsic reality of its own. Everything, even this body that we tend to cherish so fondly, isn't it also a result of causes and conditions? Where is the self that we seem to think inhabits the flesh? What's left when this is reduced to a pile of ashes, or when it becomes food for worms? If there is no inherently existing self or soul, what is there? Obviously something. We function in this world. This table is not mere nothing. But if all things, events, and persons are without any intrinsic reality of their own, if everything is emptiness, then what is this world of phenomena, and what are we, the consciousness, we think, that perceives it? Here some schools, like the idealists, called Chittamatran, fall into an absolutist pitfall by saying that there is nothing but the mind, ultimately emptiness, and denying any reality at all to self and things. In this way, they're similar to the idealist or pantheist schools in Western philosophy. Other schools fall into the nihilistic trap by asserting that the only reality is the relative one, that emptiness is just meaninglessness, completely negative. The Madhyamaka Prasangika school avoids both of these extremes. Unlike the absolutists, it does not deny the relative, designated reality of persons and things. And unlike the nihilists, it does not deny the reality of the absolute. Rather, it comes to the conclusion that the relative can only exist because of the absolute, and the absolute can only exist because of the relative. Or, expressed more poetically, the all is the one, and the one is the all. By correctly deepening our understanding of this emptiness of intrinsic reality of all things, we eventually come to the direct realization of emptiness, which transforms us and gives us the ability to relate to things freely and to beings compassionately. This is our highest possible happiness, nirvana, or enlightenment, the freedom from suffering that is the bottom line of the Buddha's teachings on the Four Noble Truths. According to the magnificent play Sutra, when he was enlightened, the Buddha first said, profound, peaceful, unfabricated, translucent, uncreated. This reality I have found is like the elixir